I've been talking about Corona more than just about anything else for the last 5 weeks now. Uh, it's kind of boring, but I'm becoming increasingly aware of the difference between people who are concerned and the medically educated people who are concerned. The gap shows up far greater when we're talking about things like a microbe or a germ or a bacteria or a virus than it does when we're just saying sunlight or fresh air and exercise and positive mental attitude. It's tougher to grasp the deep science if you have no science training. So it's interesting to see the different opinions as they're developing.
So what's been your reaction to this whole situation? How's your thought process kind of went and responded to this?
Okay. I have so much. It's in two things, right? Like in one way, I don't want to talk about it at all because it's not worth talking about. It's a flu. But in another way, it's the biggest thing going on in the whole wide world. And the things we are doing, the steps we are taking in order to try to stop the flu are going to be, I think, far worse, or have already been and are going to continue to be far worse than the actual coronavirus itself. The numbers don't support the reactions. So is it a fast moving thing? Are people dying? Do I feel badly over every death? Those are all yes answers. Does it kill a very specific portion of the population? Absolutely yes. In that way, it's truly, it's pretty much no different than any other flu, but it is unique. We've known about coronaviruses for more than 70 years. There's corona as a part of almost every other flu we've ever studied. Ever since we've been studying flu, we know that corona typically makes up, a portion of every kind of winter illness that comes around, certainly the flus. And this one is its own, flu, if you will, it mutates every year. It changes a little bit each time it comes around, hence they all have different names. And even the same one changes a little bit every year. It's very hard for me to get excited about the flu. It's much more easy to get excited about the social media. This is a social media driven situation. It's almost 100% social media driven. And if we didn't have an internet, nobody would have noticed this flu. The numbers are so small, and compared to other years' flu, I mean, the total world death rate from coronavirus hasn't even yet reached what is typically the death rate of the United States alone. We typically lose 500,000 people a year to flu in the world. And in the world, I mean, we just don't have, 1% of that. We haven't even reached 1% of the typical annual flu death rate. That's
so take us to some of the other numbers you're talking about in terms of you saying that it doesn't really
I have a lot of numbers. Some of them are in my head. Some of them I've even written down. But I mean, if we look at in a typical year, 1/10 of 1%, so 0.01% of the people will die of flu, and about 1%, 1/10 of 1%, 10 times as many, 1/10 of 1% will be affected by flu. So, it's a small number. In this flu, once again, we see there are portions of the population that are just plain unaffected. I mean, children under 10, I don't know, there may have been some cases of coronavirus in children under 10, but it's statistically it's zero. It's just not happening. We're having like 80% of the people who are seriously affected. More 80% of the people that are seriously affected are over the age of 70, and almost half are over the age of 80. Sometimes we look at a hurricane and say, oh, how horrible the hurricane, so much destruction. But if we look at what happens in nature from a hurricane, the ocean bottoms are cleaned out. Any branches on trees that are weak get broken off. It creates a phenomenal new growth, a resurgence of growth, a resurgence of life. I am not a callous person. I'm a very feeling person. But the non-productive portions of our society, the people who are constantly in and out of hospital, the people who have chronic, degenerative, debilitating, pathogenic conditions that are very soon going to take them down. The fact that they caught the flu because their vitality levels were so depleted after 50, 60, 70, 80, even 90 years of, as you called it, they're not following the science of human health. They're not living hygienically. They're not taking self-constructive behavior to its ultimate levels. These people eventually break down. There really should be a huge distinction between people who die of coronavirus and people who die with coronavirus. As we're seeing, the numbers support some 97, 98%, possibly even higher percent of all the people who have died from corona had 2 or 3 or more other complications of respiratory illness, of heart disease, of cancer. These are people of obesity, of diabetes, or all of the above, and then they get the flu and they die. Well, I feel terrible that they die. And nobody, I feel terrible anybody dies, but dying is part of living, and that's just how it is, and we have to live with that reality. If this was a serious problem, like bubonic plague, 50% of the people who get bubonic plague and don't get treatment die. If this was septicemic plague, 100% of the people who get septicemic plague die if they go untreated. And if this was something like that, we would go, oh my gosh, it's a plague, but this is a flu, and right. It's affected about 1% of the typical flu worldwide. I mean, the number of people who typically get flu is somewhere in the 5 to 50 million range. It's a huge gap depending on the specific flu, but it's like 5 to 50 million. And we're just not even seeing anything approaching those numbers. Granted, it's still growing. In some places, it's still growing, but in some places, it's already peaked